In this episode of Roach Reflections, I want to talk about bread as a roach bait. Bread's one of the great roach baits. Maggots is probably the other main one. I've also caught big roach on casters, hempen tears, and they have been caught by people using lobworms over the years. At least one record was caught on a lobworm. Ray Clark's record roach was caught on casters. I don't think many records were caught on bread. Possibly Bill Penny's was caught on bread. He was a great exponent of using bread. I started using bread when I was still, before I was a teenager, because it was a free, cheap bait. My parents would give me the end crust of a loaf. This was before the days of sliced bread, or we didn't have sliced bread. And this would be pretty stale, and I would just soak it and knock it up into a ball of bread paste. And using soft bread paste, I caught roach way back in 1969. As I got more pocket money, I tended to fish with maggots more, but I realised that bread would work on the frume and on the piddle. And then when I started to fish the stour in the early 70s, I started to realise that bread was good there. And people like Dob Chislett, one of the great Christchurch anglers, was a great exponent of bread fishing. So as I went along, I learnt more and more about bread. At Wareham in around about 1972, on the towpath there in the summer, a Bristol angler called Sid Bruton used to come down and fish with bread punch. And I realised bread punch might be quite useful. Someone at school used to do a bit of shooting in a small shooting range using 22.22 bullets, and he gave me spent cartridges of the .22s, and I made those into my first bread punches by using an old paintbrush handle. This is the sort of artist brush, not a great big 4-inch brush you use for painting the walls. And that was my first bread punches. As time went on, I got the Abbey bread punches, which had interchangeable heads. And then much later, I started to make my own bread punches. First of all, from obsolete rod ferrules that I got from Dave Swallow. He had a great drawer full of them that no one actually wanted. Of course, now they're highly sought after. People trying to replace brass ferrules on ancient rods. I make bread punches with hard balsa and brass tube, and I'll show you pictures of those. I think the thing with bread is to realise the different forms. The basic form I used all those years ago was bread paste, and it needs to be very soft. I've tried it on and off over the last 20 years and never really done any good. So nowadays I tend to either use bread punch in up to about a size 12 hooks. That's a fairly big punch. Or once I get up to the sort of 14s and 12s, a little tiny pinch of bread flake. And the size it needs to be is about the size of your thumbnail. That's all. You don't need the great big lump of a sort of 1.5 inch across that you might use for chub. Bream fall for bread flake as well, and chub and bream will go for the bread punch. Now and again I've had good bream when I've been roach fishing, and I've had at least 1 6-pound chub on throop when I've been fishing for roach with a pinch of flake. Something that when I'm on fine gear it gets a bit hairy, but it's not a bad bonus fish whichever way you look at it. The other method of bread that does exist, something I've used very occasionally, is known as pressed bread, which is where you soak a slice of bread crust and then place it between boards with weights on top of it overnight, and then you cut squares of it off. It's very, very soft, and this is a clue to what bread's about. When you put it on the hook, it's fairly hard with bread punch or bread flake. Obviously with flake you want to pinch the tiniest bit of it on the shank. Most of it should be fluffy, just enough to hold it on the hook. When it's in the water it just becomes a soggy mess, and people worry about, is my bread still on the hook? Well, it should still be on the hook, and when you pull back at the end of a trot, it will probably fall off. Now and again, especially with a big bread punch, it will stay on the hook for more than one cast, and quite often I've found that when it's on for a second cast, even a third cast, and you have to pull back gently and cast very gently, I've often caught really big roach because they've almost drunk it in, even though it's quite a big bit of bread. And that's what this pressed bread does as well, this wet bread, as Bill Rushmer calls it. You've got to have confidence in bread. I've been using it, as I say, over 50 years. I've caught many big roach on it. I still use it a lot. It's not my only bait for roach. I probably, on somewhere like some of the still waters I fish locally, I use maggots almost all the time. In the summer on the Stour, I tend to use hempen tares, fishing tares on the hook. But I will fish bread in the summer sometimes, and certainly from late autumn right through to the end of the season, I use bread far more than maggots. Back in the day when I fished at Wareham a great deal, I caught more roach on double maggot than I did on bread. But, and this was the but, the important bit, there were certain days when after a big flood the river was fining down, it got just right, that green-brown colour in the river, same as on the Stour, when using a lot of ground bait and a big lump of bread flake or big punch on a 12 would absolutely slaughter the roach. Big catches of big roach. And that was something that very rarely did on maggots. I'm not saying I never did it on maggots, did get big catches of big roach on maggots occasionally, but there were more big catches, or I got more big catches on bread than I did on maggots. On the days after that, once it had fined down a bit more and gone fairly clear, it was much harder to catch the roach on bread. It would work while it was perfect, but not when it was much harder. One way to gain confidence in using bread is simply to take nothing but bread fishing and to fish for roach with it. You only need half a dozen slices. Back in the day, you used to use brands like Sunblessed and Mother's Pride. Nowadays I think it's Hovis Soft White. That's quite a nice loaf to use in a medium slice. You can use the thick slice if you want to use flake, but medium slice seems to be about right for both flake and punch. You don't seem to get thin sliced anymore, which in the days when people went canal fishing, as I did occasionally, with 22s and tiny little punches, you wanted the thin slice, not the medium. Together with some bread, I keep it in a separate bag. I only take out a slice at a time. Keep the bag tightly shut so it doesn't dry out. If it's on a warmer day in the summer, for instance, I'd only take half a slice out at a time and try and keep it shaded. Once it starts to dry out, it's no good. It just gets sort of tough and not much good. With bread, you've got to feed something. When you can just fish a bit of bread and hope. There's quite a few approaches. Back when I started, we used to just buy Groundbait. It would have been Kestrel Superfine to start with, and then we discovered Kestrel Angler's Crumb, which was just a basic white groundbait, white crumb. Not quite as fine as the Superfine, but a good feed to fish with bread. Nowadays you can buy brown crumb, which is what I often use. You can get white crumb. White crumb tends to bind a lot more, but it will work for bread. And my favourite groundbait, which I'm always banging on about, Sensa Gros Gardons. There's also a Sensa Gardon, and the Gros Gardon seems to have 3 incarnations. There's Gros Gardon, which is fairly coarse compared to the others. A Gros Gardon Fine, which is finer, and a Gros Gardon Noir, which noir is black. And the black one's got some dye in it, and you end up with sort of black hands, basically, with blue streaks. The finer ones, the Gardon, the Gros Gardon Fine and the Gros Gardon Noir, seems to attract smaller roach as well as the bigger ones. So if I can get it, I go for the Gros Gardon just a plain ordinary old one, and I mix it maybe 1/3 of brown crumb to 2/3 Gros Gardon, or 50-50 with brown crumb. If I want something really stiff, I might mix in some white crumb. At one time, the crumb you buy, that nowadays when you get brown crumb and white crumb, it's very, very fine. You used to be able to buy either what they called medium crumb or even a coarse crumb. And I like those a bit better for if you just want to feed groundbait, but you can't seem to get those anymore, so I'm not quite sure what the answer is with that. Another alternative is to use a blender to just blend a loaf. So if you bought a couple of loaves of the soft white, like I say, take out 6 slices or so. I reckon I'm using about a slice an hour for hook bait in normal fishing, so it gives you an idea how much. If I tend to fish 2 or 3 hours, so I'm only using 2 or 3 slices usually for bait. So if you're going to fish 6 or 7 hours, you might want to up that from 6 to 8 or something like that. And when I use the blender to knock it into crumb, I just tear up 2 slices at a time, quick whiz in there for 30 seconds at the most, not too, or even less than that. Don't sit there running it for 20 minutes solid, you'll burn them out. They just don't like that. And the one I'm using at the moment is a Tesco's own brand blender, which cost about £14. I don't know if Tesco still do them, but you don't have to buy an 80 quid blender to do blending for fishing. I did have a Molyneux one, which was quite reasonable, very good one. When we got a new kitchen, I stored it in the garage, stacked up on something, it fell off and smashed it to bits, which was the end of that one. And that was a better blender than my cheap Tesco one. So there's a lesson to be learned. The trouble with liquidized bread, or as we call it there, is that on a very slow river you can chuck it in, or on a canal, they call it the Licky, those fishing up in Lancashire and Liverpool, and it will sink nice and gently down. But throw that into the Stour, as I was fishing on Boxing Day, 11 foot of water that's heaving through, and it won't hit bottom till Christchurch, and I was fishing 10 miles above that. It just won't go down in its own form. It's okay in a feeder, quite like using it in little open end feeders, and I did a video about bream fishing down on the tidal Stour not long ago, earlier this month of December, and it's good for that sort of fishing and fishing for roach with the moving feeder. But you can just mix some of that liquidized bread into your ground bait. You'll get a few more particles coming off that. There's a few ideas. You can wet it and throw it in, that might get down it, but you're probably again going to need fairly shallow water. It's not a bait to get into deep water, whereas the Gros Gardons got binders in it that will dissolve, so you can put it in fairly stiffly. And that's what we used to do with just plain ground bait in the days when we used white ground bait. We were chucking in cricket balls, and if it went clonk when it went in, that was good. If it went sploodush, it was maybe a bit soft. If it was a gentle splash, all you probably had was a great cloud of ground bait floating down the river 3 foot under the surface, nowhere near the fish. You wanted it to go down to the bottom and then break up. And it's amazing how much ground bait you can use to get the roach going when there's a lot of big fish there and they're really having it. Dob Chislett showed me this trick in Ireland back in about 1979 when we fished the Blackwater, when it was fining down after a flood. And those with long memories will remember the Irish Bait Supplies white ground bait that we used to say you could use it as mortar on building a brick wall. Stiff stuff, but he said, look, just mix it up, whole great big bowl full, really firm, solid cricket balls, and smash it in there. My God, did we catch some roach, 60 and 70 pound bags of big roach. And we learnt that lesson on the Froome, and my best ever day, they're getting 10 over £2, another 10 big ones. I went through 14 pounds of dry ground bait that day, which was 4 washing up bowl full. which is a lot of bait, but that's what they wanted. And every time the bites dried up, I mixed up another load. Another way of doing things is to get a loaf that's slightly stale and to soak it maybe in your landing net and then mash it up, mashed bread in other words. That's going to sink better than liquidized bread. But again, it's being in the right sort of swim. You've got to know that that's getting down to the fish. Some people get rid of the crusts when they do that. I don't worry about the odd one floating as long as there's not too many ducks and swans around. That's quite a good feeding method for chub as well. It'll bring chub and roach. And it's something I've used on the Froome years and years ago. When conditions were perfect, they took a lot of groundbait on the bread. That was the way to do it, groundbait. But when it went clear, sometimes they'd have maggots for a while. And then after a couple of weeks, sometimes you could just put in a little bit of mashed bread, fish a big lump of flake on a 10 and pick up the odd really big roach. Wouldn't be a lot of fish, just one or two, but it did work. It would fool them. They got fed up with maggots. They didn't want a lot of groundbait. So definitely a method to think about and try out. I hope I've got you thinking about bread. It's a tremendous bait, very cheap. Even a single loaf isn't going to cost much over £1, which is a third of a pint of maggots basically. And I always keep some frozen bread in my bait freezer. I use it fairly quickly. You don't want to keep it in there more than a couple of months at the most. I've always got some ground bait, so I can go fishing fairly quickly if I need be. Please click like and subscribe, and I'll talk about maggots and casters in the next one in the series. Cheerio for now.